This episode is divided into 3 parts: active imagination and the play instinct, practicing active imagination, and creativity and madness. I'm Lisa Lorraine H, and this episode is part 4 of a series that considers how useful a Jungian-orientated framework is in developing an appreciation of visionary art. So let's begin. Part 1. Active imagination and the play instinct. So Jung states that every good idea and creative work owes its origination from the imagination and fantasy, with play acting as the dynamic principle. Through play, an individual disregards directed and critical thinking and instead reacts to the impulses and images that stream in from the unconscious. Jung describes, "The dynamic principle of fantasy is play, a characteristic also of the child, and as such it appears inconsistent with the principles of serious work. But without this playing with fantasy, no creative work has ever yet come to birth. The debt we owe to play of the imagination is incalculable." So according to Jung, engaging with play and imagination in their raw state possess no viable worth, and instead need to be brought a stage further. This is acknowledged by the differentiation between active and passive fantasy. The latter refers to low-tension fantasies, whereas the former describes high-tension fantasies. Jung states, "Active fantasy is one of the highest forms of psychic activity. For here the conscious and the unconscious personality of the subject flow together into a common product in which both are united. Such a fantasy can be the highest expression of the unity of man's individuality and may even create that individuality by giving perfect expression to its unity." Active imagination is a high-tension fantasy play which exists spontaneously by nature herself or can be taught to a patient by an analyst. Darrell Sharp defines active imagination as a method of assimilating unconscious contents through some form of self-reflection. The role of active imagination is to establish a line of communication between the conscious and the unconscious to produce the transcendent function, preventing unhealthy psychological projections and potentially enabling the individuation process. So even when the end products are not interpreted, something still goes on between the creation and creator that contributes to the transformation of consciousness. Active imagination can be reflected in any creative act, such as drawing, painting, sculpture, writing, dance, and music. Part 2. Practicing active imagination. Jung's technique for inducing spontaneous fantasies consists of methodical exercises for the elimination of critical attention and negative judgments. Once this is achieved, a patient would then concentrate on a specific mood and attempt to become conscious of the fantasies and associations that arise in connection with it. This fantasy-free play then hopefully leads to bringing a symbolic expression of mood to consciousness, making it more understandable. Jung describes the process of active imagination in 2 stages. The first stage is like dreaming with your eyes open. You can either begin by focusing on a dream or fantasy image, or by concentrating on a bad mood and associating visual imagery with it. When an image has been chosen, an individual needs to fix this in their mind and focus their attention. Jung instructs, "Usually it will alter, as the mere fact of contemplating it animates it. The alterations must be carefully noted down all the time, for they reflect the psychic processes in the unconscious background, which appear in the form of images consisting of conscious memory material. In this way, conscious and the unconscious are united, just as a waterfall connects above and below." So the second stage moves beyond simply observing the images and requires the individual to actively participate. Jung describes, although to a certain extent he looks on from the outside impartially, he is also an acting and suffering figure in the drama of the psyche. This recognition is absolutely necessary and marks an important advance. Jung states that it is a psychic fact that this fantasy is happening and you must recognize your involvement by entering it as if you were one of the fantasy figures. The Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz describes the same process as talking to our personified complexes and trying in our imagination and fantasies to personify certain aspects of our complexes and have it out with them. As there is an archetypal core to every complex, you can potentially engage with universal and archetypal imagery with this practice. Jung discusses 4 possible results when engaging with active imagination. 1. The subject cannot get past Freud's free association and gets caught in a circle of his own complexes. 2. The subject has a purely aesthetic interest and remains stuck in a sequence of theatrical images. 3. The subliminal contents in the subject's psyche overpowers the conscious mind and takes control of the personality, potentially triggering a descent into madness. Or an individual successfully produces the transcendent function. For the process of active imagination to be successful, the subject needs to concentrate on both aesthetic formulation and understanding of meaning. Jung describes how when the subject focuses too much attention on the aesthetic form, a kind of condensation of motifs into a more or less stereotyped symbol takes place. Whereas, when the focus is placed chiefly on understanding the content, it is subjected to intellectual analysis and interpretation, which essentially diminishes the value of the symbolic content. For this practice, it is essential that the ego and the unconscious are treated equally. Jung advises, the ego takes the lead, but the unconscious must be allowed to have its say too. Jung states that this is an important warning, for just as the conscious mind of civilized man has a restricting effect on the unconscious, the rediscovered unconscious can also have a dangerous effect on the ego. Part 3. Creativity and Madness. The creative person who engages with the visionary mode of creativity generally uses the fantasy function spontaneously in their practice. Matthews describes how these individuals stay close to their unconscious into adulthood. They stay closer to the symbolic mother, the creative matrix, and so often portray shades of the infantile or maladaptive, even to the pathological extreme of madness. Exploring artistic creativity and its links to madness has been a curious subject for many, including Jung, who considers it an unconscious invasion. Jung suggests that the creative person experiences a duality of contradictory qualities. He believed that madness within the creative person is not pathological in origin and is instead an unfortunate side effect of the tension between the conflicts of the inner and outer world. He describes, the artist's life cannot be otherwise than full of conflicts, for 2 forces are at war within him. On the one hand, the common human longing for happiness, satisfaction, and security in life, and on the other hand, a ruthless passion for creation which may go so far as to override every personal desire. Jung describes how the creative impulse can drain an artist of their humanity to such an extent that their personal ego only exists at a primitive level. This regressive development of conscious functions can manifest into infantile traits such as ruthlessness, selfishness, and vanity. An obvious example of this is Vincent van Gogh, who embodies this dark association of genius, artist, and insanity. An expression of his infantile traits can be seen in the year 1888 when he sliced his own ear off with a razor blade and presented it to a local prostitute. This link between creativity and madness is going to be discussed more thoroughly in future videos, but for now, if you have attempted to engage in the practice of active imagination, I would love to hear about it in the comments. I publish a video on the series every second Wednesday, so goodbye until then.